Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. I apologize. I was just adjusting something on Instagram as we were going live. Um, I'm Annette Richmond. This is Content Marketing School, and I'm so excited to have Rayna here with me today. I feel like I kind of met you through my friend Brenda Meller because she's the one who told me to listen to Adam's podcast, Podcasting Business School. And I heard you on one of his shows, and I was listening to you, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have got to get that woman to come on my show. And luckily, you said yes. And so I'm so delighted to have you here with me today. And for anyone who doesn't know you, please tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
All right. Thanks, Annette. Hey, everyone. My name is Rayna Rokicki, and I am a podcast growth coach. And a lot of people might be like, wait, what is that? Like, I know what a podcast producer is, a podcast editor, a podcaster, but a podcast growth coach. I specialize in helping entrepreneurs grow their business with a podcast. So if you are a coach, a consultant, an author, a speaker, a service provider, and you have a podcast because you want to share your wisdom, I can help you take that content, design your podcast in a way where you can start monetizing with it and not with sponsors. So just more about bringing you clients, getting you booked speaking gigs and so on. And it works. It's super fun. I'm, of course, a podcaster myself. I've spent a lot of time as a podcast and YouTube producer, and now I'm in the coaching space. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, I am so excited to learn from you today, and I am going to be asking you for some tips about that as later on in our show. And I think it's so funny because I want to ask you about people launching podcasts. And I launched my first podcast during the pandemic, and I had a friend of mine who was doing a podcast at the time, and I had no business as a pandemic. And so I messaged her like, well, gee, how are you doing that? She goes, I'm just reading my blog. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I could do that. I have a lot of material. So it wasn't that I was reading it, but I was using my blog, and that was kind of my basis of my, was solo episodes. I started doing LinkedIn Lives, and I just kind of brought them, into that podcast. So my point of this is that it was kind of like this happenstance kind of thing that went together, which I'm guessing is not the best way to be doing a podcast. So I'd like for us to start to jump right into have you give us some things that people should be thinking about, some considerations if they're interested in doing a podcast. Like, what should they be thinking about? Because I'm guessing podcasting is not for everyone.
Yeah, great point. And as you demonstrated, there are many avenues, ways to get into podcasting. Sometimes they're roundabout. But, I think podcasting has really grown, especially since the pandemic, and for good reason, because people love listening to audio. The one thing I really love about podcasting, it's the only platform out there where you can multitask. So you can be driving in your car, listening to a podcast, walking your dog, folding laundry, whatever it might be, cooking dinner. You can't do that same thing with YouTube, with Instagram, with the blog, things like that. But if you want to get into podcasting, I think you need to consider, are you getting into podcasting as a hobby? Like you have a passion project and you just want to share information, or are you doing podcasting as a business, like podcasting to grow your business? Because you really have to know your why you're podcasting, because that'll really determine how you create your show, how you design your show. And also ultimately, the way you're going to market it. So a lot of people, the people I work with, of course, are trying to use podcasting to grow their business and use podcasting as a business. So we design shows in a different way. And just to give you an example, like if you were a coach or consultant and you're trying to grow your business with a podcast, I would recommend using the 2/3 expert positioning rule, meaning 2/3 of your episodes are going to be solo episodes. So just you positioning yourself as an expert, giving tips, giving advice. A lot of podcasters, when they start out, they do a lot of interview shows, and those are super neat, right? You get to learn, you get to network. However, it's not positioning you as an expert. So your audience just sees you as a great interviewer, but they don't see you as someone to go to get advice, to work with. And so that's something to be mindful of. But again, if you're just doing a podcast about some really specific, like I know you love dogs, Annette. So if you're going to do a podcast about rescue dogs, like awesome, that you can definitely just do interviews. But if you want to grow business, we got to think about it differently and design it differently.
Yeah, that is such an important point. And as I mentioned, I started out solo, and then I started my LinkedIn Lives, and my show was after that till until I moved to this new show was completely interviews. And I had heard that it's funny because sometimes you have to hear things like two or three times.
Yeah.
And I heard someone talking about that earlier I guess about this time last year, as I was getting ready to launch this new show. And they were saying that, when you're only doing interviews, you're seen as the entertainment host and
Yes.
it's not your expertise. And that's why people like me wonder, oh, okay, why am I not, because I'm not being seen as the expert, because obviously you're here on my show. This show is about you and sharing your expertise, not the host. So one of the things that and that was one mistake. I was going to ask you to give us some mistakes that people make. And that's one, I guess, relying on interviews because, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about how to get past that
Yeah.
later, but um what are some maybe a couple of other mistakes that people make when they do launch their show because they just don't know any better?
Sure. Another big mistake I see that I work with a lot with clients on is organic discoverability. So the way that new listeners find your show. So for example, a lot of people, when they're like, yes, I want to do a podcast, I'm so excited. They want to come up with this very snazzy name. Maybe it's based off a book they wrote or their branding. And well, it sounds good in theory, right? But the problem is, unless people already know you, no one is going to be able to find your show on iTunes or Spotify. So you have to really think like, okay, if I'm a new listener or if I'm the ideal listener for my show, what would they search for on Spotify, on iTunes so I would come up. So you have to dig into those keywords. And once you determine what, maybe those 3 keywords are, you want to make sure that they are in the title of your show. That doesn't mean you can't have a snazzy name. You could have a snazzy name and then do a title extension to your show. So to give you an example, I have 2 podcasts. One is called Podcast Growth Club, and that's me giving tips and strategies for podcasts. But my first podcast was my passion project, and it was called You Betcha She Did. So You Betcha She Did. It's kind of like a fun Midwest term, and it's all about cool Midwest women doing neat things. Now, I love the name. I thought it was really cool. But of course, I know no one is going on Apple, iTunes, Spotify. She did. No one, absolutely no one. If they know me, sure, but no one is. So what I did is I kept You Betcha She Did because I love that name, but I added You Betcha She Did business tips for women coaches, entrepreneurs, and rad women. So if people are looking for business tips, I'm going to show up. If people are looking for women coaches, women entrepreneurs, I will show up. And that ever since I've done that, I've definitely seen my podcast grow, my audience size grow. But so that's a mistake. Your name of your show should be really obvious and intentional and not snazzy.
Okay. Yeah. And I know that it's all about the SEO, and it's so interesting because my husband is actually an SEO guy and I am a former magazine writer. And so, I love the clever name. I love that, but again, now my current, although I did have just, my other one was Smarter Business Moves, and this is Content Marketing School, obviously, got this idea from Adam's podcast, Podcasting Business School. But your podcast is Podcast Growth Club, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And I should know because I've listened to it, but anyway, it's the catchy name. You have to be thinking about what people are looking for. And I love the idea of adding the sort of tagline to it. So how long can something like that be though? I mean, you don't want to be like too long.
Yeah. And a lot of this I learned actually from Adam because he's my podcast mentor. So, and he's done a lot of experimenting and then I use it on my clients and this stuff really works. So what's neat about the title extension, the add-on, is that you put it into your podcast hosting site. Buzzsprout lives in Spotify and it lives there, but you don't have to mention it. So your podcast could still be called Content Marketing School, which has some great keywords. And if you wanted to add more into that, it can live there. It can work in the algorithm, but you don't have to say it every time you introduce your show. You can just be like, welcome to Content Marketing School. I do know that, the paid podcast platforms like Buzzsprout and Libsyn, they allow more characters. You can have longer descriptions, longer titles. If you are using a free podcast hosting platform like Spotify, you're going to be more limited. So again, that's kind of that tip of like, if you are doing podcasting as a business, you should pay for a hosting platform. You'll get more tools, more analytics. If it's just a hobby, then yeah, go for the Spotify kind of free hosting platform.
Oh, absolutely. I've been using Buzzsprout since I started my first podcast, and the bells and whistles that you get, the ease of having your podcast everywhere. I had some friends with using a free platform, and their podcast was maybe on Apple and Spotify and one other place. My podcast is everywhere. And it's
Exactly.
because I'm using Buzzsprout that it makes it so easy. It's just kind of like a click and go.
Mhm.
And most of the people, actually, the friends that I have that are using the paid, are using Buzzsprout. And you mentioned Libsyn, and is that another paid
Yes,
that?
another great one that I personally love Buzzsprout. That's what I use too. But Libsyn's, I would say, equally as good.
Okay. Okay. Good. Well, it's always good to have more than one option. It's
Yeah.
always good. So one other thing that I want to ask you about, because I think, and this is something that I am guilty of, and you had mentioned in the 2/3 rule, and I have heard that as well. But it is challenging to do the solo episodes, and so if you could give us some tips on sort of how do you get over that hump. And even for me, although I feel like I have a lot of knowledge, it's difficult to sit down. So do you have some strategies and length? I mean,
Yeah.
how long it needs to be, maybe.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, this is, believe it or not, this is something that comes up a lot with my clients. And then
Oh,
for
I
the
bet.
same reason,
I bet you it does.
yeah, people are a little nervous to dive into that solo, right? It's like a muscle. You got to flex it and then you're going to get better. So one tip I like to start off with is thinking about when you're planning out solo episodes, remember they don't have to be as long as an interview. Usually interviews are like 45 minutes, an hour, maybe 30 minutes. Solo episodes could be short, sweet, quick tips. Like you could probably think of 4 key marketing tips that you could share. And each of those tips you could talk about for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, right? And all of a sudden you're like, okay, I can do a whole month's worth of content. I've got 4 great content marketing tips. I'm going to take an hour. I'm going to outline each of those. And then I'm going to take another hour and I'm going to batch record them. Because if they're each like 10, 15 minutes, bump, 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 and then you're like, okay, I did it. And my clients, when they do this, they find it wasn't as hard as they thought. They're like, oh yeah, I actually had a lot of stuff I could share in that 15 minutes. As far as episode length, it's hard to, I wouldn't say there's an ideal length, but I want you to keep this in mind. So in 2024, the average car commute in the United States was 22 minutes. And
Okay.
I found through being a podcast producer and a coach that the episodes that do the best are around 20, 25 minutes. And I like to think it's because people, when they're commuting, a lot of people do listen in the car, or even if you're working out or going for a walk, most people don't have more than a half hour of time. And one great pro tip too, if you go into Apple Analytics, so you go into your directory, Apple Connect, Apple has the best analytics for podcasts that I found. So when you go in there, you can actually look at the percentage of the episode that was listened to, and that'll be a great indicator for you as to whether your episodes are too long or just right. So if your episodes are 45 minutes and then you look at your stats and they say most episodes on average are listened to 65% of the way through, then you probably want to bring them down to 30 minutes because most people aren't making it through that episode. So those are 2 things to think about. Think about short, sweet episodes for solos that you can kind of link. Those are really nice. It kind of gets that bingeability. Like this week, we're talking about this tip. Next week, this tip. And then dig into Apple Analytics. See what's the average length your audience is listening to of your own podcast. It'll also give you a great indicator about which episodes were the most popular, which ones really were listened to like 90% of the way through or more.
Yeah, And I do that with my interview shows are about 30 minutes. My interview with then there's the intro and the outro and the, little bit of music. And I found that too, when I first started doing my LinkedIn live shows, they were an hour.
Yeah.
And then after the first year when I was doing them kind of sporadically, then I went to 45 minutes. And then after a year, I was looking around and everybody I knew was doing 30 minutes. And 30 minutes is just kind of enough where you'd like to keep the conversation going. And which is so much better than, okay, we got another 15 minutes to talk here. So what are we gonna be talking about? So one of the things, and I like the idea of batch, I try to do that with video content that I do to batch create it. When I have my hair and makeup done, it's perfect time to do some videos. So can you talk a little bit about consistency? Because that is a challenge as well, being consistent. And while I love the idea of, batching a bunch of podcast episodes, I know that that's not going to be something I'm doing like this month because I got other stuff going on. So what do you suggest would be a good sort of calendar or plan to have for your podcast if you're applying that sort of 2/3 rule?
Yeah, you definitely want to produce weekly content. That is really important because you become a habit in someone's life, almost a ritual. And when you don't show up that week, for whatever reason, they might find something else to listen to, and they might not come back. So you have to make sure that you are always showing up week after week, and that's tricky. That's a lot of work. But again, if you're using a podcast to grow your business, it's just part of that, and you can batch ahead. With that 2/3 rule, then if you think of weekly episodes, you need about 3 solo episodes a month. And then you can definitely still do interviews. One could be an interview. Or if you're like a coach or a consultant, one of those could also be you coaching someone on air. So you're the expert, you're helping them through a problem. People kind of get to see how you work. And that's also super powerful. So it's not too bad. If you think about doing shorter style episodes, and just being intentional with planning. Like I like to tell my clients to plan out at least 12 weeks ahead. Not that they've got them all edited and done, but it's like you have a plan for the next 12 weeks so that when it does come to recording time, you're not, pulling straws, trying to figure out like, what am I going to do this week? What am I going to talk about? That being said, stuff pops up. All of a sudden a topic becomes hyper important and you can still fit that in. You can be flexible and adaptable, but this way you have a lot of ideas to pull from.
Yeah, it is, it is, I think part of the challenge for me is I'm kind of a fast talker. And so someone else that is more trained, like somebody I know who is he's a radio host. And Christopher Johnson, he's a radio host, and I mean, you listen to his voice and it's like butter.
Like butter.
But for someone, someone like that, who is, more, I don't know what you would call it, regulated in their speech, because for me, I can, go through and it's like 7 minutes later, I'm like, oh, okay, what else can I say? And so that's a struggle. So let's say that have people now listening now and on the podcast, because this is going to be a podcast, and they're saying, okay, all right, Rayna, I started my podcast and I've been going along with my podcast, and I'm not really getting anywhere. Can you give us, maybe 2 or 3 tips? I'm not asking you to give away all your secrets because, you gotta, that's what your clients get. But can you give us a few ideas for people like me who are saying, my podcast, I'm getting 40, 50 downloads, but I want to do better.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's focus on growth then. Like, how do we get to grow your podcast? So we talked a little bit about that organic discoverability using keywords. So we definitely want to have it in your podcast name. You want to have it show up in your podcast cover, your description, and then start incorporating some of those keywords into your episode titles. Like I would find 3 or 4 keywords and pop those where it makes sense, obviously, into titles, or future plan them into titles. Because again, when you're on Spotify or iTunes, if someone searches up content tips, if you keep using that word, you're going to start to show up for it. So that's one thing. The other big thing that I think podcasters don't do enough is podcast guesting. So getting on other people's podcasts and talking about your show, talking about what you're doing. And here's one more pro tip that I tell my clients too that works really well. So when you're on a show, like this, don't just say, oh, I have a podcast. It's called this. Come check it out. Give them specific episodes that relate to the topic you're talking about. So for example, in my Podcast Growth Club, we are talking about how podcasters start to grow and make money. I would say check out episode 1. I talk about the 4 zones of podcasting success. And it talks about how you are a beginning podcaster all the way to making meaningful income. And check out episode 6. It's all about how to make your first $1,000 with your podcast. So if you give people specific episodes, just like I did, people are going to be more likely to check them out because they're like, oh, I already like this topic that you talked about. And now I want to get more information from the great Annette. I want to check out episode 54 and 88, but give them a number. Make sure you number your episodes. So if you're not numbering them, do that.
I love that you said that. And I'm glad that you added the idea of numbering them at the end, because I never did that. And that was something that I learned to do. And luckily when I learned it, it was with my new podcast and I only had like maybe 20 episodes. So I was able to go back and number them. And it certainly does make a difference. And I know if I have if I'm sharing a podcast in my newsletter or one of my podcasts in my newsletter or on, a snippet, soundbite on LinkedIn or something, that I always make sure to put the number in there because it's so important to put that number everywhere because it's so easy for people to go back. And so I thank you for mentioning that. So what, when it comes to, episodes, and can you give us just one tip on how to be a guest on other people's shows? And I will tell you, I will just share my experience.
Yeah.
I have enough that I constantly get emails from people. Most recently, it was a financial services CFO who was going to be this great guest on my show. I had some, and they're all from agencies pitching me a matchmaker. And I feel like, and then sometimes if I'm feeling snarky, I email them back and say, do you even know what my show is about?
Yeah.
So that is not a good strategy. So can you give us a good strategy for that?
Agreed. Same as a podcaster, I get like 5 pitches a day. And yeah, like you said, they're from PR agencies, and I'm just going to throw them under the bus right now. I'm sure there's some good ones, but I don't see them a lot. It's these really generic pitches. They don't even know what your show's about. Like my show, You Betcha She Did. It's kind of obvious that it's about women, and I get pitches from men wanting to be on the show. And I'm like, I do not feature men. Have you listened to any of these shows? Anyway, yeah, you don't. Okay. So what I recommend is something called the Add Value First podcast guest method. And this is something I learned from Adam. It's awesome. And it's all about, first, you want to invite the person you really want to be on their show, invite them to your audience first. So maybe you do LinkedIn Live and you said, hey, I would love for you to come on my show. Maybe you have a podcast, you can bring them on your podcast. Maybe you have a blog or a newsletter. Feature them first so they get to know you. You start to build that relationship. And then they'll see like, hey, this person really knows a lot. And they're more likely to invite you to their show. It's not obviously going to happen every time, but it's a much better outcome than just this kind of cold generic pitch. If you are going to do a pitch, please do your research. Be sincere. We can easily tell if you've listened to the show or not. And also, like when people pitch me, I'm looking for things like, what are specific takeaways I can give my audience? Like, how is it going to transform my audience? So be intentional. Like, what are things you can really share that's going to be helpful for their audience? Because that host is taking a risk bringing you on. They want to make sure it's meaningful for the people who are listening to it. So I would, invite them first. The other thing I would recommend too is Podmatch. And it is a website that was created by Alex Sanfilippo. And it's pretty great. You can apply to be a guest or to be a host looking for guests. And what I like about it is that if you are a host and you choose one of the guests, you have to match the profile and like what they said. But as a host, you get paid to choose these guests. So hosts are more likely to want to work with guests on there because they're getting some money from it. Not that it's all about the money, but they look to see if you're a good match, and then they're like, yeah, this makes sense for me. So that's another place I'd recommend. It's called Podmatch.
Wow. Well, that is so cool. Now, I have already picked up a bunch of tips from you today. So I am right now sharing your LinkedIn profile. And I know that you share information. You have all kinds of things in your featured section for people who want to learn. And you do share content regularly as well. So I really do appreciate that. And I just want to ask, are you open to like connecting with people on LinkedIn?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Yeah, please reach out. I'll be the one answering the DMs. I like connecting with people. I love helping people. So that's what I'm all about. Yeah, don't be a stranger. Come say hi.
Well, I love that. And I always like to ask all of my guests at the end of the show because it goes by so fast. And I thank you for all the great things that you've shared today. But what is one thing that you would like to share that you feel would be important for people to know that I haven't asked you and we have not discussed yet?
Okay. So one thing I wanted to bring up is the fact that a lot of people think that podcasting is too saturated. There's too many podcasts. And I'm going to say that's not true. And here is why. So according to the Podcast Business Journal, from this summer, there are 4 million published podcasts out there, which you might be like, 4 million, Rayna, that's a lot. However, of the podcasts that released a new episode this summer are within the last 30 days. So of the podcasts that are still active, of that 4 million, guess what percentage are still active? What do you think, Annette?
I'm going to say 3%.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a little higher than that, but not that much. It's only 10%.
Okay. 10%.
So,
I was trying to be low,
yeah,
so
that's okay. But there's only 324,000 active podcasts who are still producing content. Now, compare that to YouTube. There's 55 million YouTube channels that are out there. Podcasting, there's only 4 million and only 324,000 that are active. And similar to YouTube, on YouTube, you need 1,000 subscribers, 4,000 watch hours to start monetizing. Podcasting, I would say, is similar, but even smaller. You probably need like 500 really good, true fans, and just a super following to start making meaningful income. So it's very doable. So if you've ever thought about doing podcasting, think about it. It's not too late. There's plenty of ways to niche down, to find your people, and it's really fun. I've met tons of people. It's brought a lot of opportunity. And if you like to talk, it's the perfect place to be. Wouldn't you agree?
No, it part of the reason that I enjoy doing my LinkedIn lives, although I've cut back on them slightly, is because I get to meet interesting people, and of course, this becomes audio for my podcast as well. But one of the things that is a treat for me is I get to invite people, particularly for this show, who are talking. I ask them to come in and talk about a topic that is of interest to my audience and also to me. And I learn, my audience learns, and I get to meet some really cool people as well.
Yeah, it's a perfect way to grow your network and have fun while you do it.
So I just want to say hello because I know we have people in the audience, and we even have somebody, a longtime friend of mine on Instagram. Hi, Dammy, on Instagram. I see you there. And so we are right now at the end of our show. It went by so fast. And I thank you again for being with me today. Again, I have learned stuff, and I know my audience has. And your podcast Growth Club is your podcast.
Yeah, come check me out.
So people can start there. They can start by listening to your podcast. Okay.
Definitely.
Well, again, I thank you so much for being here with me today. Everyone else, I will be back and see you again, same time next week. So have a great rest of your day. Bye now.